Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Grey Goose of Arnhem, the story of the most amazing mass escape of World War II, by Leo Heaps. Narrated by Chris Macdonnell. In the town of Ada, a section of German panzers was billeted next door to the house on Torenstadt where Brigadier John Hackett recovered from his wounds after the Battle of Arnhem. Early in December 1944, these troops requisitioned from a local farmer a large grey goose, which they began to fatten up in preparation for their Christmas dinner. Hackett told the three old maids who nursed him that he intended to steal the goose so they could have it for their own Christmas. Cordenoy, the eldest sister of the household, thinking of the safety of her hunted guest, sternly dismissed the idea. Nevertheless, the thought of that fat, succulent goose continued to haunt Hackett for several months. One way or another, he was determined that the goose would evade the clutches of the enemy. Finally, the day came when the brigadier felt well enough to attempt his escape through the swamps of the Biesbosch. He asked the three maids to listen to the BBC 9 o'clock news on a particular night in February. If he succeeded in crossing the enemy lines, the announcer would broadcast the code message, "The Grey Goose has flown." Preface. After the Battle of Arnhem came to an official end on September the 26th, 1944, another battle began. It was one of attrition, then escape, for most of the 250 men hidden in the woods, fields and houses around Arnhem and Ada. It represented a war within a war, where individuals and groups, assisted by the Dutch resistance, made some of the most remarkable escapes in World War II. All the characters who appear in this book, except a few, either escaped, tried to escape, helped those who did, or died in the attempt. Frankly, at the beginning, I was not interested in writing this book. I had already published my story of Arnhem, Escape from Arnhem, 28 years ago. Besides, journalists had written too many colourful accounts, historians had dissected the operation, and I had no intention of reviving memories that I thought had perished. Then, by chance, I rediscovered some of the characters who had been my companions. They were a fascinating lot. Many had been the first commandos and paratroopers in World War II. In their own right, they were a dedicated, ingenious and audacious band. There may never be others like them. The Memorial. Just before 2 p.m. on September the 15th, 1969, Sergeant Keith Tex Banwell of the 10th Battalion stood ready at the open doorway. High overhead, jets flashed by like silver darts in the sun, so that the old DC-3 Dakota seemed to be standing still in mid-air. Deep, warm memories surged through the mind of Banwell. The Dakota, now all alone in the sky, lumbered onwards towards Ginkle Heath. This would be his 650th jump. He looked sympathetically at the nervous faces of the young men standing behind in readiness, some of whom were a third his age. They had seen the plane for the first time shortly before they boarded the craft for takeoff in England. The Dakota belonged in a museum. In fact, that is where it came from. It bore little resemblance to the giant, sleek C-130E Hercules with its 4 turboprop engines, presently used by the paratroops. The young paratroopers, in fact, were enacting a bit of history. But to Banwell, now a legend among the men of the 10th Battalion, everything seemed as real as the day it happened. They came in peacefully over Ginkle Heath at exactly 2 p.m., and the plane sloped in towards the dropping zone as the red light changed to green. At that second the past swept suddenly before Banwell's eyes. He watched in silence as the port engine of his Dakota suddenly fell apart. Shrapnel struck the starboard engine, and it spurted into flame. A Spandau opened fire from a clump of pine trees, and the burst of bullets ripped the fuselage, almost cutting it in half. 6 of the 15 paratroopers lay dead on the floor. As the American pilot fought to keep the plane in the air, Banwell, at 500 feet, stepped out and shouted to his men to follow. Most of the paratroopers struggled clear over the dead bodies to the doorway as the Dakota became a flaming coffin, hurtling uncontrollably to the ground. As Banwell floated down to Ginkle Heath to what he thought would be certain death on that afternoon long ago, the past events of his life had flashed before him. Now it happened once again. He pictured himself enlisting in 1931 as a private in the Coldstream Guards, fighting the Pathans and Kashmiris on the mountainous northwest frontier of India, operating in Arab dress out of the Kufra oasis in the sweltering heat of the Western Desert in 1942, a member of the Long-Range Desert Patrol, captivity at Tobruk, escape in a half-track, later imprisonment in Crete as a commando, and finally escape in a fishing boat to freedom in North Africa. Escape, capture, escape. That seemed to be the rhythm of his army life. When Banwell landed alive in the knee-deep grass of the heath, he had witnessed the strange charge of Lieutenant George Mackay, his platoon commander, a sight he never forgot, as he sprinted single-handed towards a Spandau mounted on top of a pile of logs on the edge of the field. The lieutenant turned around several times in a grotesque death pirouette and fell full of bullets on the grass. In the distance, Banwell's Dakota crashed among the tall pines. Then Banwell, pinned to the ground by machine-gun fire, could not move more than a few hundred yards in any direction for 2 days. Eventually he managed to reach division headquarters at the Hartenstein Hotel with 2 survivors, Corporal Bill Cuthill and Private Ginger Wadcote. Banwell wondered where his companions were now. All this and more passed before him in a matter of seconds. Time seemed to have gone out of sequence. Then the present returned. The countryside was strangely, almost reverently silent. Ginkle Heath was empty, but along the jammed roads and pathways of Oosterbeek, thousands of people waited expectantly, craning their necks upwards towards Banwell floating down through the bright autumn afternoon. The Battle of Arnhem was exactly a quarter of a century old. The beginning. The planners at the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe realized after the invasion of the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, that their armies had to reach the industrial heartland of Germany if they wished to quickly win the war. The German war machine was fed by the heavy industries in the Ruhr Valley. Therefore, the Allied advance was designed to ultimately cut off the retreating German forces in North Holland, and then to swing eastward to take the Ruhr. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had come to the conclusion that only a most daring plan could achieve the objectives. In late August, the plan was born. There were some people who raised their voices against the operation, but they were not vigorous voices, for it is difficult to contradict a conquering general flushed with a string of successive victories. Even General Dwight Eisenhower hesitated to object when his own Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, warned him against Montgomery's plan. In August, Eisenhower reluctantly concurred with Montgomery. A final paralyzing blow must be dealt the Germans. An airborne invasion would cut off the enemy retreat and shorten the war by many months. That at least became the grand strategy as the ground troops advanced across Europe. The Germans were retreating everywhere on the Western Front. All that remained was the final lunge at the enemy's jugular to finish him off. On paper the plan looked good, invincible. The Allied 1st Airborne Army under Lieutenant General Louis Brereton and Deputy Commander Lieutenant General Frederick Browning would carry out the strike, which would be named Market Garden. The American and British airborne forces would undertake the market part of the operation. Meanwhile, the ground forces of the 2nd British Army, led by the tanks of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks' 30 Corps, would batter their way through to join up with the para and glider troops landing ahead of them. The ground operation became known as Garden. 5 years of German occupation of Holland looked as if it were finally coming to an end. Confined to a life of grinding boredom in England since June, the men of the 1st British Airborne Division were impatient to fight. Major General Roy Urquhart's soldier would have accepted any plan, no matter how hazardous, in order to enter the battle for Germany. The American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions waited with equal impatience. The rapid advance of Allied armour caused the planners in Montgomery's headquarters to constantly alter the objectives. All during the summer after the Allied invasion of France, this great airborne army waited for the signal to set off. Some of the cancelled plans offered relief rather than disappointment, at least for Urquhart. The code names seemed to indicate the impetuous nature of the hastily conceived operations. Wild Oats became the order for Urquhart's division to land a few miles ahead of the Allied beachhead at the French town of Évarcy after D-Day. As Urquhart said, it would have been rather sticky. He was pleased when Évarcy was overrun and his troops were not needed. Then came the abortive plan for taking the concrete fortifications of Saint-Malo, where the German Atlantic submarine fleet was based, raising Brittany. A reckless joint campaign with the French Marquis never happened. Hands Up, Sword Hilt, and finally Transfigure, where the British were to rendezvous with the Americans and thus take Paris, suffered the same fate as all the other cancelled plans. Allied headquarters kept projecting the waiting airborne army into operations ahead of the advancing armour all through France and Belgium. Week after week the troops went on the alert and then stood down again. Altogether 16 operations were planned and cancelled during that hot, dusty summer of 1944, as the Allied ground forces thrust forward and the Germans wearily retreated back towards the homeland. By September, the frustration of the waiting troops, confined to barracks at the announcement of each new operation, mounted to unbearable proportions. The short leaves after each cancellation offered only temporary relaxation before the waiting started all over again. A kind of dull, fatal resignation set in among the airborne, who were now convinced they would never really be used. Perhaps the American divisions were more likely to be launched into battle than the British, whom Montgomery had decided to commit at the extreme limit of any strategic plan to block the fleeing enemy. Then suddenly it happened. Operation Market Garden, scheduled for midnight on September the 16th, was not cancelled. By 5 a.m. the following morning, as a pink dawn spread across the green fields and country lanes of England, the first wave of troops was on the lorries and on the way to their pre-designated aerodromes. By 8 a.m. the last of the transports rolled up to the fields, where the grey gliders and Dakotas waited in position. The little villages, the stone-turreted castles and country estates where the troops had been billeted were suddenly empty. All that remained of the airborne bases was the skeletal framework of the divisions, a few ground troops who would later follow overland as the rear party. Eindhoven, Grave, Nijmegen and Arnhem became the Dutch towns selected as the main targets. They ran almost in a straight line south to north. The towns dominated major river barriers and canals, whose vital bridges had to be secured for the passage of the tanks of the Guards Armoured Division that would come up from the south as the spearhead of Horrocks's 30 Corps. The armour drove on relentlessly from Belgium, where it had crossed the Albert and Mouzescon canals to rendezvous with the airborne carpet about to unroll before them. Furthest to the south lay the town of Eindhoven, around which the 101st U.S. Airborne Division would land under command of Major General Maxwell Taylor. The 101st would then proceed north to take the bridges that spanned the Wilhelmina and Wilhelms canals. Taylor's divisional objectives would extend north to the next barrier, 35 miles, the long bridge at Grave that vaulted the sluggish water of the Maas. At Grave, the 82nd U.S. Airborne Division, led by Major General James Gavin, would have a bitter struggle to dominate the main road that stretched another 10 miles north to Nijmegen, and thus also control the bridge on the River Vaal. Therefore, the two American airborne divisions would dominate the bridges over 2 canals and 2 wide rivers in preparation for Horrocks's advance. The Americans eventually secured their objectives, but not without days of bloody battle. However, one bridge remained to be taken, the bridge over the Rhine at Arnhem. After the drop on September the 17th, news of the 1st British Airborne Division filtered back very slowly to Montgomery's headquarters. The reports from Arnhem were fragmentary, confused. No one knew if the British held this last link, without which the grand strategy would collapse. Something seemed to have gone wrong at Arnhem. It was as if all the strength, all the effort of the Allied attack had been expended with the taking of the first two bridges by the Americans. Meanwhile, the tanks of the Guards Armoured Division pounded on north, hoping to join up with the scattered para and glider troops at Arnhem. It took 2 precious days for Urquhart to put down his entire division on the dropping zone at Oosterbeek. 8 miles west lay the bridge. On the first day, less than 200 men, consisting mainly of mixed troops, reached the town, the fulcrum where the Guards' tanks were to turn eastward into Germany. Without the bridge at Arnhem, Market Garden would have little to commend itself for the extravagant waste of life and materiel. The Battle of Arnhem and Oosterbeek began quietly on a warm, sunlit Sunday. It ended in catastrophe 9 days and 10 nights later on the shores of the Rhine for the 2,000 men who were eventually ferried to safety over the river. Between the beginning and the end, over 9,000 British soldiers were killed, wounded or lost. In the contracting crucible at the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek and the ramparts of the torn bridge, the men of the 1st British Airborne Division made their last stand. They were overwhelmed by parts of several divisions of German troops. Tanks appeared unexpectedly. Endless cascades of mortars rained down, while lack of food and ammunition hastened the end. Perhaps Arnhem might have been just another battle, forgotten among all the others of World War II, if those few scattered Englishmen had not resisted so stubbornly against great odds. The 1st Airborne Division, made up largely of veterans, were among the very best soldiers Britain had. But the Arnhem operation could not succeed. The advancing Allied armour managed to link up with the Americans, but the tanks were stretched too thin to be effective. They were trapped too deep in the muddy meadows on the one slender road that sped like an arrow from Nijmegen to the Rhine. They could not reach the British defenders. When a small reconnaissance unit of Allied armour finally did struggle through to the south bank of the Rhine on September the 20th, the Germans had retaken the bridge at Arnhem. For 3 days a gallant force under command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost had held it. The Battle of Arnhem is now over 30 years old. Already people are remembering it like Sebastopol, Dunkirk, and one day far ahead might even think of it as some kind of fiercely contested Thermopylae. Concentrated into a few days, intense, brutal, one-sided, it developed into more of an organized slaughter than a battle. The enemy had the advantage of numbers, tanks, and terrain. The British were driven to preposterous acts of ingenuity to survive. The 9 days they held out represented 7 more than they were ordered to hold. Their stubborn endurance allowed others elsewhere to consolidate and hold their positions. Around the bridge at Arnhem and on the grounds of the Hartenstein Hotel at Oosterbeek, the lifeblood of the 1st Airborne Division drained away. It was never again reformed. Perhaps that is the ultimate tribute that could be given to the men who once filled its ranks. The Evaders. The leader of the 4 men falling through the moon-filled sky called himself, for security reasons, Captain Fabian King. In his records at headquarters of the Special Air Service at Moor Park near London, his real name was listed as Gilbert Sadikirchen, and his nationality Belgian. Once he had been a lawyer in Brussels. The others were also Belgians. Corporal Jules Renier, a one-time circus acrobat, had been trained as a wireless operator. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp in Germany in 1940 and made his way to England by way of Russia. This would be his 3rd mission with Kirchen behind enemy lines. Often the Dutch resistance leaders would watch in amazement as Rainier swung like a monkey on the rafters of a barn, setting up the radio antenna. The other members of Kirchen's team were René Pietcoin, a tough former miner, and Jean Moiser, a quiet small corporal from Brussels. Kirchen was convinced that the long, wearisome road of war that began for him with the humiliating capitulation of the Belgian army in 1940 would soon end on a Dutch meadow on this September in 1944. His briefing had prepared him for the rapid overrun by the advancing Allied Second Army coming up from the south. The mission was expected to last for 5 days. He eagerly awaited the time when he could continue his law practice in Brussels. 4 years before, Kirchen had escaped from France after imprisonment by the Vichy government in Marseille. Through Spain and Portugal, he had slowly made his way to England, where he joined that small elite band called the Special Air Service. On this mission, Kirchen had 2 objectives. He hoped to discover the bases for the new German V-2 rockets being launched against London, and also to supply intelligence for the Allied airborne landing in Holland in the operation known as Market Garden. Kirchen had arrived 48 hours before the airborne invasion would begin. He hoped the Dutch resistance men were better organized than his French contacts on his last mission to the Ardennes. The British pilot carefully deposited Kirchen and his men in the middle of the correct meadow with all 24 containers intact. The wireless set and generator suffered no damage. Kirchen was a good deal more lucky than Dick Kracht, who used the code name of Franz Hals, had been. Kracht, sent out on a disorganized, ill-fated mission, sponsored by Military Intelligence 9, commonly called IS-9, parachuted down near Barsen, not far from the town of Ada, in June 1943. He barely missed the church steeple, brushed against a large poplar tree, and tumbled into a ploughed turnip field. All his equipment, including his radio set, landed many miles away and was lost, and later retrieved by the Germans. According to Kracht, the impatient Canadian pilot switched on the green light 10 minutes too soon, because he had a date in London in 3 hours. Kracht's survival was due to his ingenuity and joining forces in the town of Ernst with Joop Piller, a Dutch Jew. Kracht, without a wireless set, little money, and a Colt 45, felt badly equipped to rescue evaders, which was his function. The paths of Kirchen, Kracht, and the evaders were to cross many times. Although Kracht had little more than the clothes on his back with which to complete a complex mission, he had one enormous asset. He spoke Dutch fluently, and after Piller corrected some glaring mispronunciations and changed a faulty identification card that showed the Dutch lions facing the wrong way, Kracht could pass easily as a Dutchman. Kirchen's drop was perfect and unopposed. The reception committee was on the field to meet him with the correct flashlight code. A car with driver was waiting on a small wooded lane near the dropping zone. Several Dutchmen quickly and efficiently gathered up the containers of equipment and buried the silken parachutes, so that in a few minutes no trace of them existed. Kirchen was astounded at the unhurried efficiency of the Dutch, a pleasant contrast to the disorganized speed and delays he had experienced when he was dispatched on the mission. Only on the truck that took him to the airport at Kieval did he have time to explain the job to his team. Once at the airport, the poor weather and timing of the Allied advance caused a frantic delay of 3 days. Cancellation seemed a real possibility. The liberation of Belgium and the hope of soon returning home gave the mission a desperate sense of urgency. It could not last very long. Kirchen introduced himself to Piet Een, the head of the reception committee, who took the Belgian team to a hunting lodge, where the keeper enthusiastically broke open a bottle of cognac to celebrate the occasion. The next day the resistance chief Lange Jan arrived, accompanied by a tall, gangling man in +4s. Like Lange Jan, Roelof van Valkenburg spoke good English. Van Valkenburg and his girlfriend, Bep Labouchere, were designated as Kirchen's liaison and courier, respectively. Kirschen took up residence at the farm of Wulflangevey, outside the village of Lindhorst. In the middle of a large meadow there were 3 shabby, unpainted chicken coops surrounded by overgrown grass. From the outside the 3 buildings looked exactly alike. However, Kirschen's chicken coop contained 3 comfortable rooms, panelled with white acoustic boards. One room had a large bed with a feather-filled mattress and quilt. A stove and sofa were in the living room, and electricity and running water provided the Belgians with luxury they never before experienced behind enemy lines. On September the 16th, hundreds of bombers flew overhead and pounded the German positions around Arnhem. Shortly afterwards, Kirschen received the official news of Operation Market Garden on his Jedburgh wireless set. The greatest airborne invasion ever undertaken had started. Meanwhile, von Valkenburg and Kirschen began to set up their intelligence-gathering system. Messages between the chicken coop on Langevey's farm and Lieutenant Colonel Ian Collins' office in the golf club at Moor Park near London began to flow daily. Quickly, the brief mood of relaxation that Kirschen felt in the luxury of his converted chicken coop faded away. A sudden message came from Collins, the GS-01 at the Moor Park Airborne Headquarters, that communications had been unexpectedly cut between the 1st Airborne Division and the War Office. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, Kirschen, following instructions, sent Corporal Renier and the Dutchman Ain in civilian clothes on bicycle to Oosterbeek to try and re-establish contact with the airborne troops. At noon on September the 17th, before the armada of planes and gliders arrived, Edith Nijhoff, her husband Albert, her daughter Caroline and son John watched 12 Sterling bombers flying very low over their house. Mrs. Nijhoff felt certain that the Ada barracks next door to her home were to be blasted, but the planes continued on their way. The Sterlings contained 186 men of the Pathfinder Company of the 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major Boy Wilson, who were to drop 1 hour ahead of the main force. They marked the dropping zone with orange smoke signals in advance of the division. Among the officers who jumped with the Pathfinders that day was Zeno, who in later years, while serving a prison sentence for murder, would write an absorbing personal account of the battle called The Cauldron. The Sterlings were alone and unmolested. The sky that Sunday remained a startling deep blue, the air delightfully serene, when suddenly Wilson gave the weird fighting cry of the division, "Waho Mahomet!" and tumbled out into space, followed by his company. The Pathfinders descended into the gracious peace of the Dutch meadows, south of the railway tracks near the Wulfheze Hotel. Wilson began preparing the landing zones for the armada of paratroops and towed hawser gliders that would stretch for more than 350 miles over Holland to the North Sea. Among all the remarkable characters of the division, Wilson stood out almost alone for his daring. An ex-jockey, less than 5 feet 2 inches tall, he came to Holland at the age of 50. Deaf in one ear, he commanded a group of men as wild and uncontrollable as himself. By some remarkable coincidence, Wilson had celebrated his birthday the day before. Few people knew his official age, but among those who did were his namesake, Boy Browning, the commander of the 1st British Airborne Corps, and Major Freddie Goff, commander of the reconnaissance squadron, who at 43, with his white hair, looked older than Wilson. In Wilson's force were 25 Jewish refugees, recruited for their ability to speak German and their exceptional fighting qualities. For the purpose of this operation, they had all changed their names and taken up new identities as Macphersons, McTavishes, and MacLeods. General Roy Urquhart, the commander of the 1st Airborne Division, a proud Scotsman himself, made sure no one used the name of Urquhart. As the Nijhoff family raced to greet the descending paratroops, they could see scattered forces of the Wehrmacht fleeting in disarray in carts, bicycles, and cars to the east in the direction of Arnhem. Birkenland-Zestien, the Nijhoffs' home in Ada, was to become a private transit camp for evaders. Since 1940, the red brick terraced house had sheltered countless Jews and escaping airmen in its specially constructed attic compartments. Edith Nyhoff roamed the countryside.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?